Rikki Lambert has joined me in our Flow studio. G'day, Rikki. How are you?
Great, thank you.
Good to talk, and always nice to bring up topics that South Australian, New South Wales and Victorian people in our regions are probably interested in. This one is, I think, of a lot of interest. We've got a census coming up, and they've got advertisements out at the moment for census collectors and so forth. But with that in mind, do you think that the numbers are going to start to show that this drift of population from capital cities is in fact happening and we're getting more people into the regions? And if that is the case, do we need a better representation politically for regional people?
Yeah, the Bureau of Statistics will come out with some data tomorrow regarding regional population movement, and I'm tipping that we're going to see a growth in regional populations during the pandemic. That'll only cover to June 2020, so it'll be the following period we'll find out how many more moved to regions. But I think in Victoria in particular, the tree change, or the vine change, or the sea change is already in full swing. So what does that mean for our politicians when it comes to being represented in our parliaments? In theory, that would mean that over time, the seats would cease to become bigger and bigger in the regions. You've got these massive seats like the seat of Mallee in Victoria or the seat of Grey in South Australia. They would become smaller because there'd be more people living in the regions. But that might take a generation for that to actually translate, and yet we're not getting regional issues picked up in the federal political arena.
Yeah, we've got some federal seats that are so large, like you've mentioned there, and they simply have too many issues and too much really for one representative to cover federally. But what happens if in, say, the upper house, the Senate in the federal situation, we go to a situation like Victoria has, or WA and Tasmania too, where in their upper house they have more of a regional zoning. Therefore, they have members of parliament for different areas of the state, but they do that in a, if you like, a regional location area, a zoned area. So could the federal government look at doing that? I mean, is there a possibility for that? And should they expand the upper house accordingly?
Well, I think there's a lot to be said for that approach. I always like picking up after the Western Australian elections, looking at their zone regions for the upper house. One's called the agricultural region. I really like the idea that you have a seat in Parliament that has a number of representatives who are representing the agriculture region in Western Australia. And I think you could get there with the Senate without even needing to change how many people are in the Senate. You don't need to expand it. You just simply say, well, from now on, South Australia, believe it or not, even Tasmania has 12 senators. 12, 6 up for election each time. So why couldn't you zone South Australia or Victoria or New South Wales to say, well, we'll have 3 or 4 metro zones. This is purely based on current population spread. But then we'd have a northern New South Wales, a southern New South Wales and a western New South Wales zone. South Australia could have a western South Australia, a northern, etc. And same with Victoria, which you do have in the state parliament. But the Senate could be represented that way as well. So theoretically, there's enough voters in those regions to elect a senator from that region, but that would require all of those voters to get behind a political brand that does purport to represent regional people. And in South Australia, that doesn't really exist because you've only got the Liberal and Labor Party in those contests.
Interesting, because the situation for federal politics would potentially mean that if we did add senators, we'd add politicians. But your scenario is that we use the current senators we have, and then we simply just put some of those into a regional part of the state that they represent in the federal parliament. Let's take that one step further, though. Because we have 129,000 people or something close to that in each federal electorate, but when those electorate boundaries in the 150 seats were created, we had about 73,000 people. So now each representative of parliament actually has to look after nearly twice the number of people that when the seat was created they used to have to look after. So do we have to have a relook at the seats of parliament, and should we have 200 seats in the federal government rather than 150? Am I advocating here for more politicians, Rikki?
Wayne, I'm going to get a bucket of cold water and pour that on top of you. I think the voters out there are not excited about the idea that we would have more politicians. It is entirely true what you're saying, and in fact it's been about 40 years since we added any more seats to the federal parliament in a large way. There has been a new seat added, one new seat recently. There's now 151 in the federal parliament, not 150. But I think what you've seen to cope with the larger number of people in an electorate to be represented is you've seen this phalanx of advisors and handlers and media managers that are working for these politicians to help them keep up with the caseload of all these additional people. But I think it's problematic to go adding more seats, because that potentially shifts the balance of power further towards a Sydney or a Melbourne, and determining what happens in our nation, and would further erode the possibility of regional representation, because you're going to get a lot more suburban seats if you added more seats per MP.
Interesting discussion, Rikki, about the geography of politics, and also the issues surrounding how many politicians we have, and whether with the growth of people moving to the regions we need better representation. It's something we're going to follow here closely, and we look forward to your comments on it at Flow News 24.